Hi, and recaps here. Today, we're looking into a Pride and Prejudice movie adaptation that takes place in modern-day America. Young Elizabeth Scott is a private school teacher who is deemed relatively good at her subject. The class is about to end and she's passing out assignments when the bell rings and she spots one of the students, Joe, leaving. She worries about Joe's failing grade in her subject, as it would prevent him from playing lacrosse for the school team. But her offer to give him extra help is rudely dismissed when Joe's father, Grant Markham, walks in. This man works for the Wall Street Journal and his wife is a member of the school board. He does not want Joe's abysmal grades to hold him back from joining the lacrosse team and bribes Elizabeth with money. But, instead of caving into his sleazy ways, Elizabeth outright refuses. She has a high sense of integrity when it comes to education and doesn't believe in giving a free pass to any student, even if that student happens to be the school board member's son. Things turn sour between them and the man departs, but not before warning her of the repercussions. Elizabeth is far too honorable to care. She deems herself right, and so, is under the misconception that the school board would readily take her side. After finishing her school duties, she races home. There, we are introduced to her adorable King Charles Spaniel, Bliss, who is soon to take part in a dog show. Elizabeth walks her to her mother's designer store, where the two of them discuss Elizabeth's decision to spend her birthday at a dog show event. Her mother wants her to get a man, and she's willing to hook her up with an investment banker, but Elizabeth resolutely denies the offer. She claims she's happy to be on her own, but those are just false delusions coming from someone who hasn't felt the spark yet. Thus, they turn towards the topic of the man who had tried to bully Elizabeth earlier at school that day. Elizabeth assures her that everything is going to be fine. Private schools have principles and integrity to uphold. Her unshakable faith in her school shatters the next morning when the principal declares he would suspend her. The school board had launched an investigation to look into the complaint launched against her. Evidently, the board is not interested in knowing the truth of the matter from the teacher to protect the students' rights. So all she can do now is wait. It is a fairly good thing then that Elizabeth has the dog show to take her mind off things. While preparing Bliss for the show, Elizabeth compares the pure-hearted company of dogs against people who would manipulate others for the sake of money. She would rather spend her time with these sweet, uncomplicated canines any day over the latter. The dog show starts, and almost immediately Elizabeth is greeted by an old friend, Gabrielle, who has information on the judge invited to oversee Elizabeth's batch that day. Donovan, Darcy, considered to be one of the best judges in New York. He is tall, rich, and runs his own foundation, which means that he earns millions. Elizabeth, while evidently charmed by his money, looks, deems him arrogant from the start. Not that he's doing anything arrogant except inspecting the dogs, but I suppose to her, anyone who judges these sweet, uncomplicated canines without being chatty and smiling has to be a cruel person at heart. When her number is called, her sister, Jenna, is already bent on convincing Elizabeth not to judge the rich guy. Elizabeth approaches the center stage but accidentally bumps into Darcy, who dismisses her happy apologies and tells her formally to get on the podium. Trying to dissipate tension, she asks him why he doesn't smile, but his only reply is that a formal event like this requires a professional attitude. Things seem to be looking good as she walks Bliss around the ring, and gets Darcy's approval on the dog having fine eyes. However, he calls her out on the freckles. Not Elizabeth, the dog, as she mistakenly assumes for a second. While moving away, he promises her that she'll learn how things commonly proceed on the dog ring, much to her annoyance. As she joins back with Jenna and Gabrielle, she remarks how rude Darcy had been to her. Their conversation is intercepted, however, with the results being announced. On the stage, Darcy puts on the second prize ribbon around her neck, and later, the trio are celebrating Lizzie's birthday when Gabrielle invites her to be her handler for a dog show in New York. Elizabeth is greatly interested but knows that the school would expect her back on duty once her suspension is lifted. Suddenly, they are greeted by Darcy, who approaches their table and cordially congratulates them. Elizabeth immediately sours up at the sight of him, and when Darcy's sister, Zara, teases him for leaving her behind like a minion, Elizabeth rudely backs her up, much to everybody's surprise. Uncomfortably, Darcy and his sister leave the pair to sit at another table, while Jenna calls Elizabeth out for her lack of tact. Suddenly, their mom joins in on their celebrations. Compared to her stoic nature before, she is all screams and shouts as she comments about divorce looking good on Gabrielle. Her boisterous remarks attract Darcy's attention, who cannot help overhearing their conversation, as she bemoans how Elizabeth won't let her set her up with someone. Embarrassed about her mom making a loud scene in public, Elizabeth tries to shush her mother, but it's to no avail, as half the restaurant has already picked up about Elizabeth's single status. Later, she gets a call from the school and hurriedly goes to meet up with the principal, thinking her suspension has been lifted early, but the principal has bad news. Elizabeth had been fired by the school board for lack of conduct, in attempting to extort money out of Joe's father for a passing grade for his son. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, Joe's mother had convinced the school board and their decision had been unanimous in letting Elizabeth go. Having unjustly lost her job, Elizabeth decides to hit Gabrielle up and asks her if the offer of being her dog handler was still open. With Gabrielle's approval, Elizabeth soon moves to New York to stay with Gabrielle at her brownstone house, which drips luxury from brick to brick. As Elizabeth is picking her luggage up from the ground, who should meet her walking their spaniel dog? Of course, it's rich boy Donovan Darcy. Elizabeth is taken aback by his presence and can only retaliate by asking him what he was doing in New York. Darcy tells her that his official address is in Connecticut, but he was currently residing here in New York at his vacation house, which happened to be in the same neighborhood. Upon hearing this, Elizabeth makes this unnecessary comment about him waking up confused every morning, not knowing which part of the world he was in. Darcy is perplexed at this open hostility from her and inquires about it. She retorts that she always acted that way because he had not made a good first impression on her, but when Darcy agrees with her and claims to do the same thing, she gets visibly annoyed. This reveals how clouded and prejudiced her judgment was when it came to him. Meanwhile, Darcy mentions his dog giving birth to a litter of puppies right across the street. This hits her with realization number 2, that not only did he reside in the same neighborhood, but in fact, right across Gabrielle's house. With that, Elizabeth carries a somber attitude all evening. Even when Gabrielle happily discusses the dog show, Elizabeth's favorite subject. Inquiring about it, Gabrielle learns that Elizabeth had just learned about Darcy living close, and that they were head deep in their mutual dislike for each other. She thinks that Elizabeth has a severe misconception, but Elizabeth refuses to agree. On cue, Darcy's sister Zara arrives at the door and invites them all to her brother's place to meet the new puppies. Once she recognizes Elizabeth, she happily remarks that Elizabeth must be the one her brother was talking about. The one who had no manners. She takes her leave, and Gabrielle smirks, knowing she has won this round against Elizabeth. The next morning they walk to Darcy's house, where his butler, Alanus, opens the door. He leads them inside where they are met with the cutest litter of pups just waiting to be petted and loved. Almost too excited, she fails to notice Darcy's aunt, Violet, and a young woman named Felicity Robson. Apologizing, Elizabeth offers to shake Violet's hand, but Violet ignores her and asks if she needs a lint brush. Elizabeth replied she was handling Gabrielle's terrier, which was why her clothes were covered in fur. Violet makes sure to ignore Elizabeth from that moment on, and turns her attention to Felicity, who is apparently a sister to Darcy's best friend, Henry, and had known Darcy for a really long time. While Violet makes a point of loudly exclaiming that Felicity knew Darcy for longer, which apparently made him part of her territory, Gabrielle quite good-naturedly points out that Felicity sounds more like a tag-along the friends kept up with out of politeness, souring whatever hope of cordiality there was left between the two parties. Darcy's sister Zara walks in and greets her guests. She wants to know where Darcy was, so he could help her with this history paper she was writing. Elizabeth offers her help, but Violet coldly intercepts and makes Felicity help Zara, even though Zara clearly was in favor of Elizabeth, seeing she was an actual history teacher. Once Zara and Felicity are out of earshot, Violet lets Elizabeth and Gabrielle know how much she favors Felicity, and even goes as far as to say that Felicity was sure to be Darcy's future bride very soon, which makes Gabrielle snort. Have I mentioned that I am really liking Gabrielle's severe lack of tact? Once the pair leave the house, Elizabeth remarks how right she was in thinking Darcy had no interest in her. He wasn't even there to meet them and was practically engaged to someone else. Gabrielle reasons that if Darcy and Felicity ever had a chance of getting married, they would have been engaged a lot earlier than this. Evidently, Gabrielle is a hardcore Darcy and Elizabeth shipper. Night falls and Elizabeth decides to take her dog Bliss for a walk. The two cuddle onto one another when suddenly, she spots Darcy's car pull up outside a hall. Darcy, Felicity, and Henry emerge. Elizabeth immediately hides behind a lantern, but Darcy has already caught sight of her, and doesn't hesitate to call her out for low-key snooping. Elizabeth trudges back inside, her happy mood suddenly taking a swift damper. The next morning, Gabrielle and Elizabeth discuss their plans for Gabrielle's dog, Rose. The dog show would begin in a couple of hours, and Gabrielle doesn't miss pointing out to her that Darcy would be there as a judge. Elizabeth just rolls her eyes, but Gabrielle teases her about being jealous when she sees Darcy's photograph with Felicity, published in the newspaper. Elizabeth remarks that she was just sad that some poor trees had to give up their life in order to have Darcy's face printed on them. Gabrielle, however, reminds her that Darcy was actually considered famous here. He had been invited to all kinds of museums and hospitals, and had even visited the White House to discuss philanthropy with the president. This impresses Elizabeth, but before she can say something, the doorbell rings. To her surprise, Jenna is at the front door to hang out with Elizabeth, and the trio prepare to leave for the dog show. While Elizabeth and Gabrielle walk their dogs inside, Jenna wanders around to check on the variety of breeds present there. She notices an owner placing a white wig on a Chinese crested and hurries back to Elizabeth to share her amusement at the weird dog show shenanigans people get up to. Elizabeth remarks how people would resort to cheating here to appeal to the judge's altar. She points out Felicity sticking to Darcy like glue, not knowing that Violet has overheard her. The passive-aggressive woman elegantly emerges from behind and remarks that Felicity and other guests were of no concern to Elizabeth and leaves, leaving Goosebumps behind. Despite witnessing Violet's icy exterior, the trio cannot help noticing that Darcy only has eyes for Elizabeth. Soon, Zara joins them and reveals that Darcy was manipulated by Violet to check his foundation affairs, knowing fully well that Elizabeth was going to turn up yesterday at his home. Elizabeth is shocked to learn that Violet has kept tabs on her, but still agrees to help Zara with her history paper. Soon, the judges call out Elizabeth's number, and she approaches the stage with Rose by her side. Darcy introduces his friend Bingley, who is the second judge. With Elizabeth being Rose's handler, Rose leaves a terribly good impression on both judges, with her sweet affectionate mannerisms and small agile body. Elizabeth walks back with confidence to Jenna, whom she finds occupied in conversation with Darcy's friend, Henry. The two exchange numbers and are immediately joined by Felicity, who apparently cannot breathe without her brother. She pretends to be much nicer to the sisters in Henry's presence, and the pair leaves after Henry obtains Jenna's number. With the final verdict about to be announced, Elizabeth hurriedly joins the others with their dogs on the stage. Darcy takes one hard inspection, and to Elizabeth's surprise, announces Rose and Elizabeth as winners. Gabrielle gets second place, and the two women ecstatically hug each other, while Felicity and Violet try not to show their evident displeasure. Elizabeth doesn't believe anything could pop her bubble of happiness, but seeing Darcy walk over to hug Felicity immediately dampens her mood, even though she would never admit it to herself. Things take a turn for the worse, however, as the trio sits on a park bench celebrating with champagne. Lizzie receives a letter from Grant Markham's lawyer, who is also Joe's father. This guy was suing her for trying to set the story straight with the school board, or in his twisted view, making fraudulent accusations where he had tried to bribe her with money. Elizabeth, now in a state of distress about her future, leaves the group to mull this latest problem in her mind. But again, she bumps into Darcy who, at the first sight of her, apologizes for not being present while she had visited earlier at his home. He tells her how hard it can be to stay ahead of his aunt's hidden agendas. He is just trying his best to make conversation with Elizabeth, but, having too much on her plate at the moment, she takes this the wrong way and inquires if his problems carry any weight, when you could be neck-deep in things like poverty, sickness, depression, or hunger. Well, just because those things are not on my list of problems, does not mean that my list is empty, replies Darcy, smooth as can be. Elizabeth dismisses that statement. After all, what difficulties could a wealthy person have that their riches could not solve? All they had to do was wave their money around, and schools could simply fire a dedicated teacher, like her, for their privileged children to get the full benefits of the institution. Saying this, her voice breaks down and she flounces off, leaving Darcy quizzically starting after her. A week later, Jenna and Elizabeth are attending a bridal market, where different wedding dresses are on display. Jenna has already deemed Henry to be the one, and Elizabeth wishes she could easily be in love with someone as well, which has Jenna in disbelief. She knows Elizabeth was in love with Darcy, and she can see the obvious sparks flying between them, but her prejudice was clouding her judgment. At that moment, Violet and Felicity also turn up at the market to look for a wedding dress for Felicity. The two of them are clearly under the impression that Darcy was going to propose to her any day soon, and maybe a priest was going to pop out of oblivion the moment the ring touched her finger. The two sisters walk off to wonder if Felicity was in fact engaged to Darcy. Elizabeth loudly asserts that she was welcome to Darcy but felt sorry for her because Darcy was a cold jerk, while the former was warm. I think the real problem with Elizabeth is not her prejudice, but rather her eyesight. If she thought Felicity was warm, the girl needs to get LASIK as soon as possible. Felicity overhears them talking and butts in. She wants Elizabeth to know that Darcy had been a wonderful friend in company more times than she can count. But Jenna swiftly cuts her off to ask her if she was engaged. This question sours her up instantly, and she coolly replies that it could happen any day now, which also meant no. With that out of the way, Elizabeth decides to meet up with Sarah, who had required help from her on her paper. The both of them sit outside a cafe, and the topic soon sways towards Felicity, and how unhelpful her aid had been to Zara. Elizabeth asks her to give Felicity the benefit of the doubt, as she could be her potential sister-in-law, but Zara laughs at that outrightly. She tells Elizabeth that Darcy was never going to propose to someone as dull as her. If truth be told, he was more interested in a certain electrifying blonde, who had arrived from Manhattan. Elizabeth likes hearing that despite herself and helps Zara come up with a rough draft for her paper with a newfound zest. Returning home, she finds Gabrielle and Jenna in the kitchen. The two had just been looking at an article that discussed Darcy and Felicity's potential engagement, but hurriedly close the laptop when Elizabeth walks in. They discuss Zara, and Gabrielle reveals that Darcy had insisted on raising his sister ever since their parents died in a boating accident. This startles Elizabeth, who guiltily remembers telling Darcy that he had no problems. With Elizabeth back in her room, Gabrielle and Jenna decide to thwart Aunt Violet's plans by putting Elizabeth in the spotlight. In the morning, Gabrielle sends Elizabeth off to a pet spa to get Rose and Blossom groomed for the next dog show. There, Elizabeth is shocked to discover Darcy, and tries to unsuccessfully hide behind a room separator but is instantly caught. She awkwardly emerges from behind, and the two exchange greetings. Darcy asks her why Gabrielle sent her over to a dog spa, knowing he would be there, and Elizabeth embarrassedly admits that everyone was trying to probably set them up. She then apologizes to him for thinking he had no problems and confesses how much she admired him for raising Zara. This breaks the tension between them, and the two joke about the rich getting tired from not working and counting all their money. Rose walks in between them and shakes her fur violently, drenching the two with soapy water, and they laugh as they help each other wipe off the dampness. Unbeknownst to them, a member of the paparazzi has captured a photo of the two together. The next morning, Elizabeth is surprised to discover Violet having a shouting match with Gabrielle. They are discussing the day's news article featuring Elizabeth and Darcy. The headline questions if Darcy's engagement with Felicity was off, and when Violet spots Elizabeth, she sordidly calls her pathetic for trying to seduce somebody else's man. Elizabeth tries to reason with Violet, but she coldly reminds them that Darcy was an important figure who needed a suitable wife that could help him soar. The wrong one would destroy him. The implication of that statement hurts Elizabeth, who finally tells her to leave. She then wonders what could happen if the press were to look into her history. They would discover the whole mess with Grant Markham, and she would be disgraced forever, never to find a job again. Elizabeth then resolves to stay away from Darcy so she could avoid bad press. The next morning, however, they have a dog show to attend. Avoiding Darcy is apparently impossible as he was the judge. Spotting Felicity, Elizabeth decides to explain her side of the story. She tells him that everything between Darcy and her was innocent, and if she could have a choice of never meeting him, she would take it without hesitation. Elizabeth hears a cough and turns to find Darcy sitting right beside her. Outraged at herself, she quickly moves away from them, only to come face to face with Violet, who cannot believe that Elizabeth had the nerve to turn up at the event. Darcy swiftly comes to the rescue and tells Violet to not make a scene. Elizabeth now wonders how she could have ever imagined herself belonging to a world where everything was subject to gossip and intrigue. However, she does not have the chance to mull it for long. Her number is called and she has to face Darcy again. She brings Rose over to the stage and, without greeting Darcy, places the terrier on the podium. Darcy quietly asks her why she was acting all offended, which breaks her stoic composure. She tells him that she did not have the luxury to ignore bad press. Like a certain wealthy person, she had the unfortunate luck to know. Darcy thinks Elizabeth is a snob, and Elizabeth rebukes him before moving back to Gabrielle, complaining how she never met a more maddening human being. When the results are announced, Darcy surprises Elizabeth by claiming her as the winner. All of this is carefully supervised under Violet's hawk-like gaze, and she decides to move in. When Elizabeth and Gabrielle are leaving, the dog show supervisor accuses Darcy and Elizabeth of being intimate with one another, thus making Darcy's choice controversial and biased. In saying that, he was allowing today's decision to stand, on the condition that she was never to handle dogs in a show where Darcy is judging terriers. Outraged by this, Darcy tries to intervene, but Elizabeth has had enough. She has already witnessed how the rich can easily fire people on unfair grounds, and thus leaves without putting up a fight. With Gabrielle at her heels, Elizabeth walks out of the dog show intending to move back to Manhattan for causing her so much trouble. But Gabrielle does not want her to move away on her account. She reveals to her that she was the one who hired the paparazzi to take their photo at the pet spa. It was all her fault, but nothing she can say convinces Elizabeth to change her mind. Later that night, Darcy visits Elizabeth to talk about what happened at the dog show. He takes her to his friend's art studio, where he apologizes for acting so unconcerned about the photo published of the two of them in the paper. Knowing that she was moving away, he tells her about how he had interceded for her at the dog show. Maybe she could stay till they reached a decision. But Elizabeth turns him down, knowing how things would go for the worst. Disheartened, Darcy then offers to hire her temporarily to look after the pups while he and Zara are out of town on family business. Elizabeth tells him she doesn't want to be indebted to him and tries to reach for a cake, but Darcy picks the tray out of her reach, not wanting her to feel indebted to him for feeding her. Elizabeth realizes that he was low-key blackmailing her into accepting the offer, and agrees, amused at his behavior. Back at his house, Darcy offers her the keys to his house, and Elizabeth asks him if Felicity would be okay with that decision. Darcy wonders why her feelings should matter, and Elizabeth teases him on spotting Felicity trying to buy a wedding dress. This makes Darcy cringe, and he inquires if she believes all the gossip around their engagement. He tells her that love was not the most important factor in a relationship, and people should marry the one most suitable for them without waiting for passion to kick in and take away their wits. Perhaps he's trying to gauge her reaction, but Elizabeth just turns away and hesitatingly tells him that he and Felicity were very well suited for one another, and he'd be a fool not to marry her, before hurrying out of the house, ignoring Darcy's attempts to stop her. Some days later, Elizabeth, Jenna, and Gabrielle are visiting the puppies, when Jenna breaks the news to them that she was invited to a ball by Henry. She pleads for Elizabeth to join her as she was too nervous, and promises to bring her back on time to look after the puppies. Elizabeth grudgingly agrees, and the two head off to the ball in the morning. Henry surprises them by walking right inside the mansion without knocking. Apparently, he's familiar with the place. They follow Henry, admiring the beautiful interior of the mansion, when suddenly Henry announces he is going to leave them for a second to meet Zara. This makes the pair realize that they are standing in Donovan Darcy's official family home. Aunt Violet suddenly spots them and coldly asks why Elizabeth, being a nobody, had the nerve to turn up to places where she wasn't invited. Elizabeth ignores her and leaves after Henry, but Jenna stands up for her sister and tells Violet that Elizabeth was a teacher at a prestigious school. Very foolishly, however, she names the school before leaving, giving Aunt Violet information she was most likely going to use against her. Elizabeth and Jane walk to the pool, where they are bedazzled by the sight of Darcy walking out of the pool. It is universally acknowledged that every Darcy character must faithfully reenact Colin Firth's shirtless scene, and Donovan Darcy does it quite boldly. Henry is surprised to know that Elizabeth and Jenna had no clue where they were headed for the ball, and Felicity snorts, claiming she didn't believe that for a second. Knowing how this was looking, Elizabeth immediately picks up her bag and leaves, wanting to get away from the place, but Darcy goes after her. He knows that she feels awkward and makes her feel welcome to stay for the ball. Elizabeth is terrified of his aunt, but Darcy admits that he'd like to see his aunt squirm when things didn't go her way. Finally, Elizabeth hesitatingly agrees to stay. A tennis match is underway at the Darcy mansion, and the crowd watches as Darcy absolutely annihilates the other player. Zara was supposed to hand him the trophy, but mischievously, she leaves the court, leaving it in the hands of poor unsuspecting Elizabeth. Awkwardly, Elizabeth has no choice but to come in full view of the crowd and cameras to hand him the trophy. Felicity is furious to witness this, and when Elizabeth is alone, she confronts her about why she was after Donovan. Elizabeth is tired of explaining that she was not after Donovan, but Felicity carries on her tirade. She accuses Elizabeth of using stupid little Zara to get close to him. On hearing Felicity so openly insult Zara, Elizabeth immediately gets defensive and tells her she's lost her respect in her eyes, but Felicity doesn't care. She leaves Elizabeth with the ominous warning that something bad was going to happen to her, and struts off, leaving Lizzie to stare at her back, now greatly concerned. What were Viola and Felicity planning now? Elizabeth, however, doesn't have much time to think things over. The ball was beginning in a few hours and she had to get ready. The ball has begun and Elizabeth and Jenna are looking striking in their gold and silver gowns. Jenna wants Elizabeth to stop worrying about what Felicity had said and leaves her to go see Henry. Soon, Elizabeth is approached by Darcy, who hands her a sparkling glass of wine. Elizabeth is nervous, but Darcy smilingly tells her how breathtaking she looks. Elizabeth shyly inquires if he was serious. Darcy confesses her attraction made him quite ardently lose his wits, and asks her out to a dance. The two head to the center of the ballroom and both waltz to the slow music. As they sway, Elizabeth finds herself admitting just how annoyingly charmed she was at the fact that he was so good at everything, whether it was tennis or dance. In his arms, she felt like she was living someone else's dream. Suddenly, a man rudely cuts in their dance, and to Elizabeth's shock, it's Grant Markham. He sardonically warns Darcy to mind his wallet because Elizabeth Scott had once tried to weasel money out of him. Darcy wants to ask him the reason behind his rudeness, but Elizabeth stops him. She finds it impossible to explain the truth of the story, and with tears in her eyes, makes to walk out of the ballroom. Grant Markham, however, is hot on her heels and grabs her arm to rudely intercept her. He wants her to pay for trying to mess with his son's future, but Darcy yanks him off of her. With their combined help, Grant Markham is led out of the room by security, failing to create the fuss he had intended. Darcy gently asks her if she wants a drink, but Elizabeth feels ashamed knowing that she might have ruined the mood of his party, but Darcy has a contrary opinion. He thinks she was the reason why he enjoyed it in the first place. Seeing Violet and Felicity hawk at them from the sidelines, Elizabeth admits that no one really wanted her to be there with him. That was why Violet had invited Grant Markham to sabotage whatever was going on between them. Darcy decides to shut all the haters up in the only convincing way he can think of. He leans forward and pulls her in for a passionate kiss right in front of everyone, including the astounded pair, Felicity and Violet. Then he turns towards the audience and exclaims that whoever was curious to know if he was engaged to Felicity or not, has received their answer. Furiously, Felicity approaches him to ask why he would humiliate her like this, but Darcy coolly remarks that a true friend would not bring a snake, like Grant Markham, into his house to disrupt his guests, and sees no reason why she or Aunt Violet should be here. The pair leave in a huff. With the haters out of the way, Darcy turns towards Elizabeth, but she does not want to make a spectacle of herself any more than she'd already had, and leaves him, sad and alone. Jenna finds her later in her bedroom and tells her how everybody was pondering whether Elizabeth was Darcy's girlfriend or not. For some strange reason, Elizabeth denies this and refuses to share what she felt during the kiss, which apparently meant nothing to her. Jenna makes her way downstairs but overhears Henry and Darcy talking close by. Henry is trying to make Darcy realize the truth about his feelings towards Elizabeth, but the man is still too proud to admit anything. He tells Henry that the kiss was just meant to shut up Felicity and Aunt Violet. Henry further teases Darcy to admit just how good Elizabeth had looked to him and the wonderful trophies she brought with her. Jenna takes this the wrong way and immediately rushes upstairs to tell Elizabeth they were leaving. Darcy learns about this and hurries after them, but Elizabeth has had enough. She thinks Darcy was just using her to fulfill his agenda of getting rid of Felicity and Violet. Darcy tries to explain that what Jenna heard was not what he meant. Yes, he had said some unflattering things, but that did not mean that the kiss did not mean anything. If Jenna had heard the entire conversation, she would have also heard him admit how he was just pretending that the kiss meant nothing. He had grown to be so reserved because of Aunt Violet's constant scheming that after Elizabeth had found a way into his heart, he had finally let his guard down and had decided they had to be together. He wanted nothing more than for her to know that despite her obstinate attitude, he was obsessively in love with her. But nothing he can say makes Elizabeth feel better. She just focuses on how his speech sounded like he couldn't bear how she had managed to capture his heart, and leaves him to go back to Manhattan. They say goodbye to Gabrielle, who tries to convince them to stay. But even bribing them with a letter Darcy had written for Elizabeth isn't enough, and the two sisters step out to wait for their cab. Curiosity gets the better of Jenna, and she opens Darcy's letter to read it aloud to Elizabeth. In it, Darcy has admitted how fresh and honest he found Elizabeth compared to other women who were always tittering and trying to woo him. She was the first woman who actually didn't care about how much money he owned and etc. Nothing, however, convinces Elizabeth to accept the sincerity of his feelings, and she goes back to Manhattan, despite Jenna trying to convince her otherwise. Back home, their mother confronts them, greatly upset that Elizabeth had the chance to have romance, but still thwarted it. Elizabeth tries to make her mother see reason. She tells her he was arrogant and entitled, which shocks her mother very much. She has looked him up and has only found amazing things about him, like how he gave all sorts of money to all kinds of schools and health clinics in poor areas. Apparently, the man gave more to charity than anyone in New York. For some reason, this sole piece of information intrigues Elizabeth, but before she can look into it further, she receives a phone call from Weston High School. The principal is happy to inform her that she was reinstated back into school with more than a 20% raise. Elizabeth is curious why everybody changed their mind, and the man reveals to them that someone had tipped the school board about information on Grant Markham that made them view the case in a different light. It was discovered that Mrs. Markham was privy to this information, so she had been forced to resign from the board and had withdrawn her son from the school. Suspecting that the mysterious tip had been from Donovan Darcy, Elizabeth turns down the offer of joining back as a teacher. Returning to her mother's bridal store, Elizabeth discovers that Henry had been successful in wooing Jenna and had rented a place nearby to always be close to her. Apparently, it had been Darcy who had convinced him to go to such lengths for Jenna, but now he had disappeared off the face of Earth. Taken aback, Elizabeth finds out that Darcy and Zara were missing but shows no outward signs of concern. With the mother already on the verge of picking out a wedding dress for Jenna, things finally go back to normal. Later, Elizabeth leaves a message on Donovan's phone. She confesses how ardently she wished to meet him so that she could apologize. She had read his letter over and over again and wanted him to know she loves him too. She actually moves back to Gabrielle's place after informing him that she was looking for a teaching job in New York. There had been so far no news of Donovan, and Gabrielle wonders if he had left with a broken heart. Weirdly, the two women comfort each other by talking about entering Elizabeth's dog, Bliss, in the upcoming dog show. On the show, Elizabeth is busy playing with her dog when someone calls out her number tag. She whirls around and finds Donovan Darcy standing at a distance, looking right at her. Elizabeth moves closer, and Donovan explains how he heard her voice messages, especially those where she confessed her feelings for him. Seeing him after so long, Elizabeth goes straight to the point. Would he accept her as his girlfriend? Donovan looks at her with a firm look and then says yes. With that, Elizabeth moves in closer and they both kiss, much to Gabrielle's utter joy. The audience claps as the camera pans away from the kissing couple, now hopefully never to let pride or prejudice cloud their judgment.